Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks to you all, and welcome to this mission to this session of Friends of Multilateralism Group on one of the, probably for me personally, one of the most dear subject, not only to me but to our group, the trade and gender. And for me particularly, because trade, you know, I mean, all my friends know how attached I'm to the trade and to the system. On gender, of course, is very important for me. First thing is because my wife works as a manager in a Geneva-based company on international trade. So she, on a daily basis, she trades many things around the world. And the other thing is that in our house, she holds not half the sky, she holds the whole sky. So in our house, it's a reverse situation of gender. But anyway, I think all over the world, the gender is still an issue in many countries, and trade should be playing that kind of role in helping balance that. So we are very glad to have such a distinguished panel and all ladies. And probably the first time we have all ladies. So I will be humble to stop here. I apologize that I have to leave around 3. But you are in good hands with Mia, our board member, and also Sherry, our FMG member. So over to you, Sherry. Thanks a lot.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lou. It's really a pleasure to moderate this session. I think it's been a long time in coming. And to my knowledge, it's the first one that the Friends of Multilateralism Group has done on trade and gender. But hopefully this will only be the beginning of future discussions, and I'm sure it will be an excellent start with the panelists that we have today on our program. So just a couple of words to set the context for this topic. It has really become so obvious in numerous fora around the world that giving equal economic opportunity to women results in beneficial outcomes, not only at the individual household level, as Liu just said, but at individual economy level and for the world economy as a whole. And many research papers have found that gender inequality is a major impediment to economic growth. And they've stressed the robust link between poverty reduction and gender equality. It seems obvious that women's economic empowerment just makes good economic sense. But in addition to that, a study by McKinsey estimated that actually achieving equality and economic opportunities for women and men could increase world GDP by as much as $28 trillion over 10 years, which is the size of the US and Chinese economies combined. However, at the present rate of change, the World Economic Forum says that we won't achieve that goal of global economic gender parity before another 257 years. This is far too long. We need to make progress on gender economic parity at a much faster rate than this. But this gender gap does not seem to be getting any smaller. So our question here today is, how can international trade help in achieving this objective? And what role can trade policy play? So we are going to explore that in today's panel. Alongside appropriate domestic policies, trade really is a key area in which greater gender equality and participation can result in increasing women's economic empowerment and reaching faster and more equitable economic growth. But evidence shows us that women are often prevented from being able to exploit the benefits of participation in trade because their rights are not clearly defined and the constraints they face are not addressed by trade policies. These constraints can include legal barriers, skills barriers, lack of access to appropriate financial products and trade finance, and also a lack of recognition of the type of work that many women do in the informal sector, among others. So how ingrained are these constraints, and can trade agreements and trade discussions help to move the situation forward? What is the WTO doing? Have trade officials and policy analysts finally woken up to the need for greater gender equality and greater women's participation in international trade, as we hope? And the million-dollar question, is 2021 going to be remembered as the year trade turned to women, as Mia wrote in a recent and very stimulating article, which I commend to you. There's a lot to dissect in this topic. So let's start. To help us sort things out, we have three excellent speakers today, all of whom have worked on gender issues and trade for many years. And we will turn first to Jane Korinek, who is an economist and trade policy analyst in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. She has recently co-authored a major study, which you have also received in advance, on how trade impacts women and men differently, and the barriers that women face engaging in international trade. And Jane, could you kindly share the main points of this OECD framework paper on trade and gender, and discuss with us what roles women can play in international trade and what barriers they face in trying to play these roles? Thanks, over to you.
Thank you, Sherry, and thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the Friends Group for the invite. Sure, I can go into at some level of detail some of the work that we've been doing at the OECD on trade and gender. We've come to this about 3 years ago, and we've developed a conceptual framework through which to look at how trade and trade policy impacts women. Problem advancing my slides. Sorry about this. I seem to have a problem advancing my slides. Let me try this again.
Leilani or Natalie, would you have Jane's slides and maybe be able to put them up for her?
Okay, I will try to share it.
Thank you so much, Leilani. Thank you.
I think, Jane, you need to quit the share screen so Leilani could put it on. Yeah.
Just while we're waiting, maybe I could mention to everyone who's listening in that all of the materials you're going to be seeing today will be put up on or have been, or will be, and after the session, put up on the website of the Friends of Multilateralism Group, and the paper circulated. And so this is something that you will have as a resource for future consultation. How are we doing, Leilani?
Maybe I will change my setting first, so could Natalie help first?
Great, thank you so much. Advance to the next screen.
Perfect.
So, thanks so much. So we've been looking at the impacts of trade and trade policies on women in 3 of their economic roles: as workers, as consumers, and as entrepreneurs and business leaders. And we find that they are impacted by trade and trade policies differently to men, in part due to different initial conditions and legal and regulatory frameworks that affect them in a different way, as Sherry pointed out. And based on the findings of our research looking into these 3 economic roles, we have suggested a framework for analyzing the impacts of trade on women at the more granular level, at the country level. And we have undertaken our first trade and gender review of New Zealand, which will be published shortly. So I'd like to give you a few tidbits of the findings of our research, and then I'll briefly describe the framework and and how it allows measurement of some of the impacts of trade on women. Next slide, please. So we find a number of aspects to do with women workers. First, the first economic role, women workers. So this data is trade and value added. And we find that in jobs directly involved in exporting, the share of men, here shown in white, is much higher than that of women, here shown in blue. There is a gap in every OECD country. And the picture is similar if we look at indirect jobs, which is jobs that are involved in producing a good or service that is then sold to an exporter. And this is due in large part to occupational segregation. Women work more in services, men work more in manufacturing and agriculture, services are less traded, and even within the services categories, women work more in services that are less traded, like health and education. Next slide, please. And another aspect that we look at in terms of women workers is wages. So we know that gender wage gaps persist. The OECD average is 13%, which means that for a 1 hour worked by a man, for which he earns, say, $1, for obviously not for an hour, but for $1 wage that a man gets for his work, a woman will get, on average in OECD, 87 cents. And that is corrected for hours worked, differences in skill levels. And so gender wage gaps persist in every country of the OECD and around the world. And trade can impact wages in a number of ways. So one way is that we know that export-oriented jobs pay better. But we also find in our research that in some countries, the export pay premium for women has been shown to be less. So since women work less in export-oriented jobs that are better paid, and the export pay premium is less for them, they will benefit less from one of the gains from trade, that is higher wages. Next slide, please. When we look at women entrepreneurs and women business leaders, we find that the businesses that they own are smaller and less well-financed. They also trade less. So there is an overlap here with the MSME trade agenda, since women-owned businesses are smaller. So the policy recommendations there have to do in large part with trade facilitation. We know that higher trade costs that result from opaque regulation and time-consuming import and export processes, those negatively impact smaller businesses more. Trading is expensive and it is also risky. So facilitating trade for small firms for whom these fixed costs are more prohibitive can mean the difference between a micro or small enterprise that trades and one that does not. Lowering barriers to trade is also a particular interest here, especially in services sectors. And I would mention here the recent non-discrimination clause between men and women in the WTO reference paper on domestic services regulation. And lastly, very important, particularly we have understood this in the last couple of years, regulatory frameworks that support an environment that is conducive to lowering the cost of internet means lower costs for businesses. And this is particularly important for women-owned businesses because we know that they engage in e-commerce at least as much as men-owned businesses. Next slide, please. And the last aspect of our framework is women consumers. And of course, we know that one of the main gains from trade that comes out of the literature, that comes out from analysis over decades, is that trade lowers prices for consumers and increases product variety. And we know that lower income households are more affected by higher prices because they spend a larger share of their income compared to higher income households that save or invest more. And women are generally poorer due to gender wage gaps and pauses in careers to care for children and elders. They are also the majority of one-parent households with children. And since lower prices through trade benefit more vulnerable households more strongly, they also benefit more vulnerable women consumers. So next slide, please. We have developed a framework of analysis in order to look at the impacts of trade on women workers, consumers, and business owners at the country level. And this framework has been developed. It is both qualitative and quantitative. And we are in the final stages of looking at these impacts on New Zealand. And in the context of that study, next slide, please, we have suggested a number of main areas for policy reform. And these are in order to strengthen New Zealand's policy mix in its support for women. So one of those, for example, is how to make its trade agreements more gender sensitive. I believe Mia will be talking about this next, some of the aspects of trade agreements. We also look into aspects that impact women entrepreneurs, like trade facilitation, how to make the trade facilitation policies more inclusive of women. Trade promotion is a big one as well. How to be more inclusive of women entrepreneurs in trade promotion policies and ensure that export promotion agencies are inclusive. Another aspect is quite simply ensuring the representation of women in trade policy making, but also as policymakers engage with stakeholders in order that women are part of the process of the policy making. And we are looking to extend this policy framework, this framework of analysis, to other countries. And in this way, contributing to the knowledge base in this area through a deep dive into different countries' trade policy impacts on women, and suggesting policy reforms to make their trade and related domestic policies more inclusive and more gender sensitive. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jane. This was a great way to start us off. Super framework that you provided, which will basically be the way that we can incorporate the points that will be made subsequently into the discussion as we see how much trade agreements and trade policies, which both Mia and Gabrielle will be addressing subsequently, can do to address these issues and these constraints. So next we'll turn to Mia Mikic, whom we all know. She's well known, formerly director of the Trade Investment and Innovation Division at UN ESCAP and an advisor currently for the Asia Pacific Research and Training Network on Trade, ArtNet, also a board member of the Friends of Multilateralism Group, and who I mentioned has just published this very recent article on the year trade turned to women. So Mia, could you please inform us what has been done with respect to incorporating provisions on trade and gender into preferential trade arrangements and agreements, both as separate chapters and as articles with within other chapters, and give us your opinion on whether these provisions are adequate to help achieve the objective of reaching greater gender equality and women's participation in international trade. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and yeah, I'm very excited that Friends of Multilateralism are talking about this topic, and as you, I share my sort of aspirations and hope that we will continue talking about that. So I do have a very short presentation, but I just want to refer back to what Jane was now saying, just to reconfirm and support the findings that she was providing for overall OECD economies. Recently, New Zealand has done a sort of a separate analysis of the firms involved in goods exports, and they have found exactly what Jane was saying: underrepresentation of women, still existent or persistent pay gap, and as she said, also the fact that the premium that normally we expect that export firms will be paying is much less for women. So, this confirms that our long-standing belief that trade is opening these wonderful opportunities for women do exist, but the access to these opportunities are still unequal between men and women. And there are different other, I think, evidence on this inequality, and I would like just to bring everyone to the findings of the recent World Bank report on women law and business, where they have actually determined that 3/4 of women do not have the same economic rights as men, and actually counted that 2.4 billion women, which is just slightly less than India and China together, do not have the legal guarantees in terms of economic access to economic opportunities. And only 12 countries, all of them OECD countries, actually legally guarantee these equalities. So when you look at that, then the job to actually raise the bar and to bring equality to women, or more broadly speaking, gender equality is really complex and difficult. And from what Jane was talking about, it is the sort of, from the literature, it is bottom-up approach where we change domestic policies and try to do it from organic way, sort of to speak. But then when you look at trade policies, and in particular agreements that are done either bilaterally, regionally, or multilaterally, is considered to be top-down approach, to which you then provide an incentive to the countries to change their domestic regulations with respect to gender to the higher sort of standards. And there are some commentators that would speak very directly about these agreements providing a carrot in terms of, in a form of market access, so that the countries would then, in exchange for that additional market access, would agree to change their policies towards gender equality or women's economic empowerment. So there are lots of terms that we'll be using here. We are not defining them because we expect that everyone is somewhat sort of informed about those. And Sherry has asked me 2 specific questions. I cheated a little bit because I asked her in advance to tell me what she will be asking me, so that I can actually extract from the literature some nice graphs. And I have to say here that, you know, none of these figures that I will be presenting to you are mine. I'm standing on huge shoulders of recent research that has been done through the WTO Trade and Gender Research Hub, but also other literature and the work of trade experts, where that blog that Sherry kindly mentioned was also published. So please, you know, share all the good things that I say with all of them, and you can critique me for all the weaknesses. So just in terms of, because I have to hurry up now, I see. In terms of evolution, obviously, we are all aware that the number of regional trade agreements have exploded after the establishment of the WTO. And with that, you would expect that as the interest towards gender equality or improvement in the position of women has also increased, that the mention of gender equality provisions would be increasing, and this is what exactly was happening. Now, you know, depends how you count mentions, explicit or implicit, in terms of the in the agreements. There is about 20% of agreements that currently do have this explicit mention, and the explicit mention is really the way how you analyze these agreements. This is text analysis, and so you pick certain key keywords like obviously gender, woman, female, etc. And I think I have given these terms here just to give you a sense of how the analysis is done. And so you can see in this figure, also from the WTO, how these darker bars have continued to increase. These are the implicit ones, but the real increase was in explicit mention of gender provisions or gender-related provisions in these agreements. And then the research also found that there, while we have this upward trend, that it is not equally represented through different regions in the world, meaning different level of development of countries involved in signing of these agreements. And when you look across the board, then the agreements that European Union countries sign, in 78% of these agreements, there will be at least one mention, one explicit provision will be mentioned in those agreements. Why? Because since 2018, we actually have a European Parliament provision that preconditions signing any agreements by having a specific gender covered in those. And then you have the least cover of these provisions comes from the agreements that are signed by Asia Pacific countries, right? Obviously, there is, if you count implicit mention, which would mean that if you are looking for the labor standards or corporate social responsibility, human rights, etc., then you will find many more agreements that are covered. So this is in terms of number, and there is much more evidence in the research that I mentioned in terms of how it differs from country to country. But what is interesting is maybe three types of findings. One, that the countries that would negotiate more comprehensively the gender in the context of separating a chapter in the regional trade agreement are very small and few to number. maybe for some surprisingly, for some not. Number of them come from Latin America, but then also they now involve, for example, the just recently negotiated agreement between New Zealand and UK. Obviously, this is still not in force. And then we have also some of the other agreements that are being negotiated. For example, the modernization of a European Union Chile agreement, etc. So there are cases still few and far in between where we have a separate gender chapter, but everything else is spread across in terms of the overall text of the agreements. You can treat it as gender mainstreaming through the agreements, and it will be nice if they were really mainstreamed in terms of binding sort of provisions in the trade or market access or some other parts of these agreements. But most of these are actually housed in the cooperation chapters, which signals to you, because normally these chapters are not ever followed up by prescribing any dispute settlements or enforceability, etc. So that also signals their softness in terms of the approach. And so I have here again listed from Jose Antonio's more recent working paper the parts of the trade agreements where these explicit mention of gender provisions are, and you will see that that basically they all are still linked to either development cooperation or domestic policies, and linked to the progress in the changes in these domestic policies. And surprisingly for me is in terms of linking to the international instruments and agreements, given that we have convention on non-discrimination for women and the sustainable development goals, etc. And then we have a separate sort of approach where a certain number of countries have started initiatives through either regional blocs like Pacific Alliance, or of course European Union through the Parliament resolution, but also EPEC, which is not a bloc per se in terms of regional trade agreement, but it does have all these initiatives that then actually succeed in providing a sort of a new solutions and new approaches. And then we have this global trade and gender arrangement that a number of countries have signed, and I think we'll be hearing about that a little bit later. So the characteristics of these, very, very, very briefly, that they are not enforced, because the language is as a soft legal language in terms of best endeavor type of things, that they are very variable in terms of what they aim to do. And so there are some that look at the economic benefits and market access, but many more are in these cooperative and capacity building areas. And that also then is aligned with where in the agreement they sit. Often they are just in the preamble or the front part of the agreements. As I said, some are in the separate chapters, but then some also have extra protocols or annexes, because they are negotiated after the actual agreement has been done. And then in terms of a form, they sometimes reaffirm what is done in these international agreements, and then very few would go directly and try to to secure some reservations and waivers so that they actually can push for equality of women in these. So to answer Sherry's question, are these provisions adequate in terms of providing gender equality? Of course they are not, because as I said, they are not binding. It's very difficult to monitor their implementation, and as has been determined by lots of recent research, they do have a nice promising language, but there is no funding, and there are no institutions that are actually also put in concrete forms in these agreements to follow up. Not in all of them, so it's not like none of this exists. There are some, but many do not. So do we then have to basically put this aside and forget about that? No, because these are treated as, you know, first, do not do any harm. So it is okay, let me just take it back a little bit. There is research that will show that basically liberalization through very deep and wide sort of covering agreements may do some harm to women's position, because they would have some adverse effects on their economic position, employment standards, etc. Right, and that of course would then question this assertion that having whatever gender provisions in trade agreements would still be an improvement to not having any, right? If you dispute the benefits of trade liberalization through the agreements per se. But taking that away, then I think we are still better off for providing some, at least some cover to gender equality through the agreements, because we are building sort of more knowledge and ability for countries to actually learn from each other through these agreements. And with that, we are also then pushing for getting more data so that we can analyze these agreements better and their impacts better, and understand which then provisions would be perhaps producing better results as compared to some other provisions. And of course, all of this needs to be accompanied by much more of capacity building on all sides. On last things that I want to say as we move forward, we really need to find sort of ways to collect much more of gender differentiated data, so that this research can actually also provide some better quantitative analysis in terms of its impact, rather than only a sort of description of what is going on. We really need to find out what are the impacts of possible provisions of these, because we now have some body of these to work with. So let me stop there, and I yield my my space to the next speaker. Then let me just stop sharing here. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks so much, Mia. This is a very detailed and comprehensive look at what trade agreements have done in the area of gender. They've started to do a lot, but unfortunately that lot seems to be very still on the basis of good intentions and not very specific or legally binding. And that tends to be a little discouraging, because that means that the progress towards reaching gender equality in economic terms is going to still be this over 200 years, and we can't wait that long. So let's turn to Gabrielle Marceau, who is a senior counselor in the research division of the WTO Secretariat since May 2020. She previously served many years in the WTO advising panelists in WTO disputes. You all know her, and she was the legal advisor to the previous WTO Director General Pascal Lamy. So now Gabrielle has written a very interesting paper looking at the legal aspects of how you can actually use trade instruments to incorporate gender related and gender favorable provisions, and maybe possibly do this in a more binding way. And so we'd like to hear from Gabrielle both a little bit about what the WTO has been doing in the area of gender since the adoption of the 2017 Declaration in Buenos Aires on women in economic empowerment. And also, please tell us how gender-related or gender-conditioned trade measures can be negotiated and adopted today that would actually have a legal effect, a binding effect, and both in the area of goods and services, if you can. Thank you. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, to the organizers for having me. And of course, I'm speaking in my sort of academic personal capacity. And in 10 minutes, I'll go through points that I share with you on this informal working group. So different things about gender and this informal working group. First, it did put the gender equality, gender consideration as an explicit mandate of the WTO. And we can argue that it was already, since sustainable development, that is one of the goals of the WTO, it's been repeated many times, covers gender, because as you know, sustainable development has both economic, environment, and social dimensions. So gender is part of that. So there's no doubt about that. Now, Aid for Trade initiative also made gender a cross-cutting issue. And at the moment, the technical assistance plan has gender across the board. So this informal working group is different from the other GSI in the sense that they insisted that it's a working group. It's informal, it's plurilateral, but they want inherently to remain fully institutionalized group. That's interesting to see. And indeed, 125 WTO members are part of the gender. That's the biggest plurilateral group, independently of whether or not you believe or the exact nature. South Africa and India are not part of it, although India has outstanding programs on women, but they're not for all sorts of reasons. Now, there were no, importantly, formal objection that was lodged to have this working group becoming a full working group. So it's different in a way from GSI. Now, the upcoming NC12 declaration. How different is it from Buenos Aires? Well, Buenos Aires Declaration on Gender, as you know, the status wasn't too clear. It was very much pushed by ITC, by Arantxa and others. It didn't have a symbol, it didn't have a logo. It was there, and it's a plus. But NC12 should institutionalize and formalize the whole thing, put a logo, and it would become the first formal declaration adopted by WTO members. So that's very important legally. And in addition, MC12 provide for a new reporting mechanism, and this will be done ahead of MC 13. It's very forward looking. Now, in NC12 Declaration on Gender, there are 4 action points. A new sort of enhanced data collection. Many do it, but now it's formalized. Maybe Roberta will talk about that. There's also the setting up of a new WTO Gender Research Hub and network. And that's very important because the goal is to make sure that the members take informed decisions on gender. And this research hub will also make public those findings. And there's also a commitment that the Secretariat will work with members on those research. Another point, point of action, is that there's really a goal of integrating gender into the WTO, and it's been mentioned already. It can exist in FTAs. I'll give a few examples in 2 minutes of how it can be integrated already in the existing provisions. The fourth point of action, it will be, if all goes well, a reference in Aid for Trade. Again, because Aid for Trade in a way was a leader to integrate gender into this. And in fact, the experience of COVID-19 and capacity building has been and can be further used to integrate gender into the WTO formally. A last point that will not be developed today, because I want to give a few examples, is the problem of access to finance that is to be further discussed in this group, but that is gaining importance. And it's been mentioned by the previous speakers, the fact that women in small business have no access to finance. So SMEs and gender do share similar issue, and this is well expressed or will be well expressed and developed with the new ministerial declaration and the work of the committee. Now, I want to give a few examples, and I see that Juan is there, Hamid, they will, I'm sure, improve or add to what I say. But with a group of 13 women in the WTO, 14, in different areas, we published a small paper that highlights a policy space that exists at the moment and that can be used to promote gender equality by individual member. I'm not saying that these provisions mandate or even encourage, but the policy space together with the goal of sustainable development can be, I believe, interpreted to allow individual governments to condition market access, for instance. So I have 4 examples. Article 2, the old Article 2 of the GATT, says that countries will respect their commitments in their schedules subject to terms, conditions, and qualifications. So it means simply that governments, especially for new products, can put gender-related conditions to a market access tariff. Of course, it has to be negotiated. And you know the old Belgium family allowance case of the 50s, where Belgium blocked, or rather didn't block, but Belgium had a higher tariff on importation of goods that came from countries that did not have a family allowance program. And of course, they lost. They lost not because the family allowance condition was wrong. This is not discussed. They lost because it was not in the schedules. But it never said that you could not have as a condition such a reference. We can think also of TRQs. In the area of agriculture, you do have, for instance, seasons sort of entries, where you can have higher level of entries at a certain period, certain conditions. So we can also think of gender-related conditions in the negotiation of a TRQ. Even more broadly, in WTO, the case law on TBT, technical regulations to trade, has made clear now, after about 5-6 cases, that governments can adopt regulations that put in place regulatory distinctions between like products or like situations, that put regulatory distinctions that are based on legitimate objective. So if gender through development, sustainable development, if gender is a legitimate objective, and I believe there's no doubt about that, well then a regulatory distinctions between 2 situations that are gender defined could be even-handed, could be fine, depends how it's done, as such, because a government would have the right to invoke gender as such a legitimate objective. Finally, interestingly, the GATS, you know, the GATS has specific obligations where you have schedules for different areas of supply, and mode 1, 2, 3, 4. We can also imagine that governments would put, again, gender-related elements, considerations, conditions into their schedules, in addition to having them into domestic regulations. So conditions exist everywhere. What is necessary to respect the MFN is that the condition in question, gender or other, is really applied equally to equal situations. I will stop here Of course, I was speaking in my personal capacity. Thank you. We don't hear you.
You're absolutely right. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. This is really, really very interesting. We've gone from the very general framework to an overview of PTA clauses on gender, which are mostly hortatory, goodwill or good nature, best endeavor provisions, to something that you have suggested on a very concrete level. So I think this is actually a really interesting progression. Before I turn to two other people I'd like to bring into our discussion, I want to ask you, Gabrielle, if you could, and you've certainly thought of this, give us an example of a gender-related conditional tariff and or a gender-related conditional TRQ that you think could be applied on a non-discriminatory MFN basis to all WTO members and could be actually identifiable and enforceable.
Well, at the moment, I'm not saying that they exist because governments that have today's schedules, let's say on tariff, may not have used gender. My point is that governments could go further voluntarily and unilaterally. And as a condition, you could, for instance, if you want to help, like we have done this paper on disasters, where you could favor imports from countries that face disaster to try to help them. So I cannot give you an example that is enforced today, but I can give you example of other conditions, that have been used. And I think Juan will come with the text. And this is where I think it's important. I'm not saying that the existing provisions mandate distinctions. And some of the RTAs and some of the work of this group wants to go further and encourage government to do things and sometimes even oblige them. I'm talking about the fact that some market access in some situations, regulatory distinctions can be conceptually put in place and then introduce gender. I would need more information on what country would need to be sort of favored and imports from where. I don't have this, but legally, conceptually, conditions to tariff, conditions to TRQ exist in other area than gender, and I'm sure could be. And then we could push this further, but our article was limited a great deal to conceptual. Now, there are other areas. These are 4 examples. There are other areas. TPR already include, I mentioned aid for trade twice because this is really WTO where aid is given with conditions of gender equality or support of gender equality. So that's the main point. I'm not saying these oblige, these ensure equality, but they allow governments to go unilaterally in that direction.
Excellent, thank you. And I forgot to mention, and I should have done this, that Gabrielle is also the author of a paper on these legal aspects of gender-related trade instruments and provisions that has been circulated as well and will be available on the website. So I encourage you all to look at that. And maybe I'll just I see that Hamid is amongst us today. So maybe while we're listening to couple of other interventions, maybe I could be asking Hamid to think of gender-related conditions that might be incorporated into GATT schedules, if possible. So I've understood from Lou, who unfortunately excuses himself, he had to leave for another meeting, that Alison Hamilton, a delegate from the Mission of New Zealand, has joined us. And I would like to turn to her, if possible, and ask her to speak to us a little bit about the fairly new global trade and gender arrangement. I think it's called GTAGGER, which was finalized in August 2020 by Canada, Chile, and New Zealand, the first of its kind, and recently joined by Mexico. And I'd like to seek her views on what this arrangement does, why it was done outside the WTO, and her views on what type of contribution she thinks it can make to improving women's participation in and reaping benefits from international trade. And then I'd like to ask Jane to make a comment on the GTAGGER and the OECD action in this regard. So over to you, Alison, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great, thank you. And first of all, my apologies for joining the session late. I was in a WTO meeting over the entire lunch break here, so I'm catching up a little bit. But thank you very much for offering me the chance to speak on the GTAGGER, which I have to say is probably one of the worst acronyms that exists in the trade policy world, and we have some bad ones. So this is right up there with the worst. But as you say, New Zealand, Canada, and Chile got together to launch the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement in August 2020. It was the first arrangement concluded under the Inclusive Trade Action Group, and it was New Zealand's first arrangement focused specifically on gender. It fits between, I think, the two ends of the spectrum in terms of legally binding firm commitments and the general provisions at the other end. It's probably somewhere in between those. And its origins are an arrangement that lies in the knowledge that trade has a positive impact on economic development, and that exporting firms, including women-owned companies that export, can achieve greater levels of profitability, of competitiveness, of productivity, innovation, and resilience, but also acknowledging that women-owned businesses and workers are less likely to be involved in trade sectors and generally face lower wages. So it's designed to bridge the gap between the knowledge and the reality that it's less likely to happen. So the GTAGGER is similar to provisions that have been included in free trade agreements, and that it's designed to assist in removing barriers that women face when participating in trade, and also puts forward and proposes cooperation activities between the participants. At this stage, the arrangement is not enforceable or subject to binding dispute resolution. It does, though, contain a review mechanism, which will see participants look fresh at the GTAGGER, including on legal form, by 2023. So that will be an important moment to take stock of the arrangement and consider whether there are additional provisions or changes to the legal nature. In terms of its commitments, the GTAGGER commits participants to advance a more inclusive approach to trade and to address barriers that women face. One of the elements is to reaffirm commitments to the SDGs, particularly SDG 5, on ending all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere. And it also recommits to the goal of gender equality in the workplace. It commits participants to cooperate, to share best practices, to eliminate discrimination in employment and occupation, including on the basis of sex, pregnancy, possibility of pregnancy, and the list goes on. So it's a broad set of provisions. In terms of how the arrangement is being implemented and expanded, for women-owned businesses, the arrangement includes cooperation activities to promote the internationalization of SMEs led by women and to encourage integration into the formal economy. And it also contains specific cooperation activities aimed at enhancing opportunities, in New Zealand's case, for Māori and for rural women as well. The GTAGGER, the arrangement, is a standalone set of provisions. It's not linked to a specific trade agreement. So in that sense, it is open for interested economies to join. And as you mentioned at the outset, in introducing me, Mexico was the first new participant at the ministerial meeting in October, I think it was, 2021. And I'm reasonably confident the ambassador from Mexico is on the line too. So it's a really positive step to be expanding that membership. So I'll leave my comments there, but more than happy to delve into the details as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alison. I really appreciate that you were willing to contribute this information, and it's a great initiative. And I guess the hope is this may inspire some of the work of the informal working group in the WTO, although you didn't say that directly, but I'm trusting that that's the case.
I didn't
Jane,
need
would
to
you
say
like?
it directly. That's certainly the case.
Okay, good. Jane, would you like to step in and tell us about the OECD action in this regard?
Sure. So Alison gave a very comprehensive overview, so I'll just add a few small points. The OECD has been very supportive of this arrangement so far. It does kind of present a blueprint for better understanding and working toward the trade and gender nexus. Looking in a very broad scope of the interlinkages between trade and women. At the OECD, we organized a webinar last summer with the ministers of the three founding countries from Canada, Chile, and New Zealand, the ministers responsible for trade, as well as some fascinating women entrepreneurs who talked about their barriers to trade and how trade agreements and trade policies can help women entrepreneurs. I'd be happy to share the link on that for those who would be interested in learning more about the arrangement. And yeah, the Deputy Ambassador from New Zealand also mentioned the signing ceremony in October 2021 actually in the margins of the OECD ministerial to admit Mexico into GTAGGER, which was quite a celebratory event in order to expand the membership. And as Mia mentioned, GTAGGER is right in there in this talk, consult and advocate kind of nexus for moving gender forward in trade agreements among WTO members, as well as kind of in the margins of WTO work.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Great to see the OECD supporting the work of the WTO in this area, as so many others. I understood from Alison that the ambassador from Mexico is amongst our group. Is that correct? Or am I wrong? Would they like to make an intervention? If not, then I will turn to a member of the WTO Secretariat. I think there's been a burning interest in the recent progress and big step forward that the WTO made in the joint initiative on services domestic regulation, which was finalized last November by 67 WTO members, and which contains for the very first time a non-discrimination clause with respect to equality of men and women in the case of authorization of measures, licensing measures relating to the supply of a service. And we've asked our friend and colleague, Markus Jelitto, from the WTO Services Division, if he could say a few words about this, how it was negotiated, and how it is there, which is fantastic, and the footnote that has been attached to this clause, and what the footnote might mean, rather than us trying to interpret it. We would really prefer, and we welcome his view and thank him for agreeing to join us today. Markus, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sherry, and thanks for having me. I'll share my screen to just put the provision up there so that you all see what we're talking about. Can everyone see this? Yeah, okay, perfect. So, so if you, on the various points you raised, so maybe let's start with the provision itself before we go into how it was negotiated. This is a provision that is part of one paragraph in the disciplines on services domestic regulation, and that paragraph is called development of measures. It before I try to share my understanding of this paragraph, maybe it's useful to recall that in the GATS, the non-discrimination clauses, both MFN and national treatment, require that no less favorable treatment is granted both to the service and the service supplier. So in other words, to the product and the producer of the product. And this is, I think, where one important angle for this provision and one important application may arise. So the proposal seeks to ensure that a service supplier, or the text seeks to ensure that the service supplier cannot, for example, be rejected when applying for a license to supply a service simply because the supplier is female. So examples that were raised during the discussions relate to reservations to certain access to certain professions, which in some jurisdictions may be limited to men, such as truck drivers or captains of ships or the like. Another example that was mentioned that was that at least in one jurisdiction, work hour restrictions apply to women, justified with a vague reference to security. Now the provision you can see here does not itself define what would constitute discriminatory treatment, but the footnote considers that there are two types of treatment that would not be deemed discriminatory. So the first of these types of treatments would be treatment that is reasonable and objective and aims to achieve a legitimate purpose. And one example for such treatment that was given was that, for example, in Canada, the Ontario Code of Human Rights allows certain institutions or organizations to employ people of one sex if the organization serves mostly the interests of persons of that particular sex. The exception is only permitted if a man or woman is reasonably, it is reasonable for a man or woman to be employed. And one example that was given here was under the Ontario Code, women's shelters serving female victims of violence would be allowed only to hire women. So that would be one type of exception. The other type of treatment that is excluded from the provision are temporary special measures aimed at accelerating de facto equality between men and women. So in other words, measures related to positive discrimination, such as affirmative action type provisions. How was the provision negotiated? This was a provision that Canada, together with Chile, Colombia, Iceland, and Uruguay, introduced in the WPDR negotiations. So it's not a discussion that arose only in the JSI. It was raised before the Buenos Aires. And initially, the provision was titled Gender Equality and addressed discrimination on the basis of gender, not discrimination between men and women. And the delegations, when they introduced the proposal, explained that the rationale for the discipline was to address real trade and development issues. They pointed to a World Bank report from 2016 on women, business, and the law that found that 155 of 173 economies that were studied maintained at least one barrier for women that did not exist for men. They also pointed to research from the Bank, the IMF, and others that has shown that legal gender differences significantly decrease female labor force participation and undermine GDP growth, very much what we have seen today in this workshop. Now, the broader reference to gender was changed and made more specific to discrimination between men and women because some delegations reported difficulties with what they considered to be a broader concept. And there was very broad support for this provision among those members who now constitute the participants of the joint initiative, except for one major delegation, which became part of the JSI only very late in the process, and which was initially very skeptical about the provision and provision, and officially supported it only in July last year when they joined the process. So this text that is now adopted was actually in square brackets until after July last year. I should also mention that there is a paragraph in the reference paper that allows participants to opt out from this particular discipline. And this is the only provision from which participants could opt out. And the reason for suggesting this opt-out initially was to accommodate delegations that were not ready to support a gender-related provision in a WTO outcome. But the longer the negotiations lasted, it became clear that delegations could practically not exercise such an opt-out because it would have put a negative spotlight onto them. So currently, none of the 67 participants has exercised the right for an opt-out. Maybe a word about enforcement. Well, you know, the idea of the reference paper is that it will become legally binding when the participants incorporate the disciplines on domestic regulation, including this paragraph, into their services schedules as additional commitments. And then it can, in principle, be enforced through WTO dispute settlement. But assuming that the provision covers both de jure and de facto discrimination, I would assume that de jure discrimination would be much easier to determine. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Markus. This is really, really very helpful. There's been so much interest in this provision and the domestic services, domestic regulation outcome, and it's really very helpful to see the WTO lead in this area, at least in one for services, and perhaps this could be, you know, broadened to other areas of the WTO in the future. Can I go back to the main screen, please, Leilani or Markus? Yeah, thanks. I promised to turn to Hamid, and I hope he's been thinking about what kind of example he might suggest for a gender-related condition that might be incorporated in the GATT schedule. I don't like to put him on the spot, but I think he likes to be put on the spot. So, Hamid, could you share with us?
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks to the speakers for excellent presentations and the clarity about this issue, which is gaining importance for very good reasons, in my view. I think I would consider myself a gender champion throughout my years of work in the WTO, and I can completely understand the cause and how important it is. I think we're talking about two types of situations, if I understand correctly. The first is situations where we have treaty provisions that require governments to behave in a certain way or to refrain from discrimination on the basis of gender or distinction between men and women. And I think Markus did an excellent job in dissecting the real example that we have, which I think is quite commendable because it's the first WTO provision ever to be a negotiated outcome on questions of gender. The other situation in which you posed your question is about examples of what members could do. So that's another situation. It's not about requiring governments to act in a certain way. It's about allowing governments to do whatever they want to do with respect to pursuing gender equality policies. And here, governments can take measures, for example, like including conditions in their licensing requirements for service suppliers regarding the standards, the regulatory standards that they have with respect to gender equality, whether it relates to equality of payment, representation, work conditions, addressing all the policy issues that were referred to in previous presentations. That is a legitimate component of domestic regulation without even getting into the scheduling point. Now, in situations, for example, where a regulator would apply those licensing requirements related to gender only to service suppliers of other members, then that would require a scheduling of a national treatment limitation. And that is legitimate to negotiate. Of course, it would not be an optimal solution, because if you're pursuing gender equality, then there would be no logic. But I'm just hypothesizing here what sort of examples and what kind of legal solutions will lend themselves to. With respect to Article 16 itself, I think there probably would not be many situations, at least that I can think of off the cuff now, which would fit within the 6 types of market access limitations, because they're all about the numbers of service suppliers. They're mostly quantitative in nature. And even if there's going to be a gender-related element of distinction here, it would probably not fit within the market access scheduling part. But as Gabrielle said, of course, the legal framework of the GATS provides sufficient flexibility for governments to pursue their domestic regulatory objectives on a non-discriminatory basis. And as long as it is on a non-discriminatory basis, they can do a lot. They can actually, I cannot think of anything that was mentioned in our session now which cannot be treated as a domestic regulatory matter, as long as it is applied on a non-discriminatory basis. So there's a lot to be done, and good luck. But thank you again for the excellent presentations, and thank you, Sherry.
No, excellent. That's really very useful. That means that we have the sky's the limit in terms of what can be done. At least in the services of the GATS, it's a very flexible instrument for including and incorporating provisions that would be gender-specific commitments, as long as they are carried out in a non-discriminatory manner. This is what I understand from Hamid. So this is excellent. I want to now turn to the participants. We have several people here. If anyone wants to raise their hand or comment. Yes, good. I see Marcel. Can I give you the floor?
Yes.
Unmute. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I appreciate the topic and the introductions. Thanks a lot. Just to start, that also gender and sustainable economic development in a broad sense is a top priority for the Netherlands, and we definitely have to do more to make sure that economic development is to the benefit of women, and that they can properly participate. And I think there are many lessons to be learned, by the way, from this broader sustainable economic development agenda. Perhaps the trade domain is even lagging behind if you look at the investment portfolio, or even in terms of financing, for example. They're excellent experiences, and these are related, of course. Unfortunate, and I think you've introduced that in the beginning, this is an area where you have to, well, promote the issue at 3 levels. The why question is still there for some people. Why is this important? Why do we have to do this? It's also about the what. So if it's important, what could we do? And then there is the how question, of course. Okay, well, fine, but how are we going to do this? And I say it's unfortunate because it illustrates that the issue itself seems to need emancipation. But anyhow, this is how it is, and let's continue then working on those 3 levels. And I would just, clearly this issue in itself needs full integration into trade policy and trade law. But at the same time, I think to work on those three levels in parallel, it would be good also to plea for win-win situations. I think a few have been mentioned. So when another issue is being promoted, and it is to the benefit of women economic empowerment, we could simply add to shouldering, of course, that activity. And the other way around is also true. If we clearly identify an area where women economic empowerment works, but it works also to the benefit of another trade objective, I think these issues are very, very powerful in convincing others. And I think I've heard a few. If the panelists have other examples, that would be excellent. Just to give you an example, we all know that SMEs in trade absorb more labor and more economic activities from the informal sector, much more than bigger companies do. That is well understood. So simply by supporting SMEs, we already support this interaction with the informal sector. And we know that in the informal sector, it's basically women, isn't it, that drive the economy. So that's an example where you can make this win-win, I think, plausible, and perhaps that can also help, of course, others to pick up this important topic. But again, if the panelists have other examples where this happens, we've heard a few, and that would be nice. But thanks a lot again for this important session.
Thank you very much. These are really very important points, and I agree with you entirely. It's very unfortunate that we're still asking the question why. We should be on to the question of what and how. Thank you for the link to the SMEs, and there is work ongoing at the WTO on SMEs, and it would be really important to incorporate the gender equality and economic opportunity for women component into that work. It's a very important point. Alan had his hand up next. Please, Alan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you to all who have spoken on this really very important subject. And it's fascinating. One question I have is, how far can countries go to condition their imports? This is not by negotiation, but under existing rules. How far can they condition imports on their social values? So they make a judgment that there's de facto or de jure discrimination against women in a certain product area or in a certain country. How free are they to, under the existing rules, import those social values into their trade policy regimes?
That's a very good question. Maybe I'll turn to Gabrielle for her thoughts on that in a second. But in the meantime, Mercedes, please, would love to have your thoughts on this topic. And nice to see you again.
Yes, Sherry. Great to see you again. And thank you to all of the presentations that we have that were fantastic. One thing that is in my mind is that I think it's very important, the three of the presentators said that data is very important. And data should be an important issue to make good research so we can convince governments that these policies could really improve the quality of the living standards in their country. So I think we need a lot of research on that to show that, and data is quite important. And that's something I wanted to raise from the presentations, and probably they can give us some more information how this will be addressed, because it's still very poor information we have on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. I think that is, in fact, one of the 4 areas in which the WTO informal working group is working, and I believe they're starting to put things up on the website. If maybe Gabrielle wants to jump in and tell us a little bit more about that, but I totally agree with you. You know, we don't have a problem if we can't measure. First, if we have a problem, we need to measure it. If we can't measure it, we cannot define it well. And if we cannot define and measure it well, then we cannot address it appropriately. So these things all absolutely go together. And right now we do not have data that are gender differentiated. And so that's very important. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I can maybe say something disappointing.
Please don't be disappointing, but
No,
definitely
no, but
tell us reality.
I told you I had this briefing with Anush that I was replacing, and indeed, as mentioned, data collection is the first point of actions for the reasons given, and they are, as you said, starting to collect data. But I also understand that it's difficult because a lot, and that's another point mentioned by our colleague from Netherlands. A lot of the woman's work is in the informal sector, for which there's no obvious transparency information, and it's like with the supply chain, where of course women and others are involved. These are all areas where the private sector is involved, less government, so data is less transparent. So all I can share, and that's disappointing, is we don't have a solution, but those who put data collection as the first action points are aware of the difficulty, but the great needs of collecting them, and whether they'll go with governments, this is where I may be disappointing. I'm not sure they have found solutions, but they're very aware of the problem. I don't know whether you want now me to say 2 words to Alan, who knows WTO better than I do, but I can try to say 2 words of an answer to this.
Please.
His question was, to what extent today with the existing provisions, a government could condition market access? And I think what I tried to do, and I think Hamid clarified it because the statement was more than services related. Governments are sovereign. They can adopt the regulations they want so long as they don't discriminate. And then the issue is that if you treat differently imports from a country based on its environmental policy, based on its health policy, based on its gender policy, can you make those distinctions? And I will limit myself, it's terribly sensitive, but I will limit myself to 2, 3 conclusions. We have a lot of examples and cases where governments, and if we think of shrimp case or Brazil tire or asbestos, where governments were considered entitled to make distinctions between situations or products that were similar from different origin on the basis of a concern, a legitimate concern. So environment is one of them because it's mentioned in Article 20. The Europeans were told that they have the right to treat importation from Canada as discriminatory and against public morals because of the way you kill seals, although that's the way they've been killed for 1,000 years. So we have recognized already that there are non-trade concerns that can justify distinctions. And in particular, in the TBT agreement, the case law has sort of merged market access and policy distinctions into one provision and one test. Are these regulatory distinctions based on gender, for instance? We have no case on gender, but based on a non-trade concern, are these distinctions? I treat imports from this country that way and imports from this other country that other way, not because of the origin of the country, but because of some environment or non-trade concern. Is this possible? I have to say it is possible in WTO today, but it all depends on how it is done. And this is the example that Hamid gave, where a government has a good policy and decide that they will not accept importations from a country that mistreats women or whatever consideration. But if they don't do it at home, of course, for national treatment and services, they can have it in the schedule, but more broadly, it's a bit bizarre. So can we impose internal policies on others? I would say yes, if it fits in Article 20, yes, if it fits in TBT or GATS rules. Does it always fit? No, it's a case by case. I've already said a lot. Thanks.
That is really very clear, Gabrielle. That's really very, very good explanation. I think it opens the door to a lot of thought and reflection, because gender is not obviously one of the things mentioned in Article 20. Therefore, we would even possibly to treat it in the way that you're suggesting, environment and
or
security
public
and
moral.
things, or public.
Gender would go under public morals. That's the
One
only
would have to
place.
make a case. One would have to make a case, and it's very interesting. That hasn't yet been argued, but
No.
it's very thought-provoking. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 3 hands up and no time. So I'm going to give every one of our speakers, other people have raised their hands at least 1 minute, minute and a half. If everyone's willing to stay and listen, I'm very happy to do so. This is fascinating. We'll start with Alison, then Jane, then Mia.
Thanks so much. And just to come in on the point of data and to really recognise that as an issue, and with an offer to share a working paper that the New Zealand government has put together in terms of the characteristics of productivity. And it takes firm level and individual level data and then adds a gender, ethnicity and firm size lens on top of it using administrative data. So from official export entries. So it's limited in that it covers goods because of that nature rather than services as well. But it does, it is an attempt to start to fill the gaps, at least from our perspective. And I know that that's an attempt to answer some of those questions on data. So I will send that perhaps to Mia if others are interested to see it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think that Mercedes is definitely interested to see it, as we all are. This is such an important question, and we might think of 20 years ago when we did not have detailed data on services trade and how far we've come since then. And, we might be looking to move in the same more detailed understanding of gender differentiated data over the next 10 years. And this would be a very important beginning. So thanks to New Zealand for putting this together, and please circulate. Thank you. Jane.
Yeah, just to add to that, so with the OECD, we've been working on this trade and gender review with New Zealand, jointly with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I think it's pulling together existing data sources. A lot of countries have been looking into how to do this. There is, especially in OECD countries, a lot of data out there. The question is how to combine it in order to, be able to gender differentiate. And we've been doing that at the OECD also in terms of the trade and value added, where we have number of jobs through the value chain, and combining that with employment data, with input-output tables, we can actually look at the gender differentiated employment involved in trade. So I think, there's a lot of data out there, especially in many countries, there's a lot of data collected, and it's like combining some of this data in new and innovative ways in some cases.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting too. If there's anything you can share with us so far, share it, and otherwise we'll be on the lookout for what the OECD is publishing in the future. Thanks a lot. And Mia, would you like to?
Just thank you, Sherry. Just to complement what was said on data, I think we are all, at least some of us are doing research, so where we are always very excited when we hear data. So what I wanted to add is that it is also important to be able to analyze the impacts of the trade agreements that are not necessarily speaking about gender, but have gender implications and impacts. And so, for example, trade facilitation agreement has enormous gender impact, and it is as Sherry knows, there are research that actually collect the data on implementation of trade facilitation measures and shows in particular what are the impacts then on women that are involved in SMEs and how they are actually enabled to engage more in trade because a country implements trade facilitation measure more fully or more quicker than the others. So it goes both ways, and so the more we learn about which measures actually produce better impacts for women, then we will be able then to advocate for such provisions to be perhaps done in a more binding way. So just that, and I will share the research that Alison mentioned that is very, very interesting and also helpful because it can be replicated. And I would actually pledge here with the representatives, it should be replicated for services, because this is where the absence of data provides problems. Thank you.
Excellent. That's really good that you brought in the link with the Trade Facilitation Index and how it implementation impacts women, and that's very important. That's absolutely true. We've had a really rich discussion on data. We should have had just a session on that alone, but I really have to bring this to a close because we're running over. Lou is not here to tap my fingers, but I wanted to say thank you to everyone. It's been absolutely a great session, really, really interesting. I think we started off discussing this topic at a high level and in a very substantive way, and I hope it will continue to be on the FMG agenda. And Lou just wanted me to say that the newsletter from the Friends of Multilateralism Group will be coming out shortly and everyone will receive a copy. But thank you everyone for your participation, for attending the session, and for contributing to our thought processes. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Gabrielle. Bye,
Bye.
Mia. Bye, Jane. Bye,
Thank you.
Mercedes. Bye.
Bye, Sherry.
Bye, Alison.